extent such projects risk violations of rights and failing to meet the climate rationale. So this event here on COP27 and on the Finance Day will explore how all actors can work together in ensuring transformative rights-based climate action. And we have a really inspiring panel of speakers here, and I'm going to quickly introduce all panelists, but you might want to say a bit more about yourselves later. We have Áslat Holmberg from the Saami Council. Áslat is a Saami from the Finnish side of Sápmi. We have Rodion Sulyandziga from the Center of Indigenous Peoples of the North from Russia. Rodion is an Udege from the Far East, from Primorsky Krai. We have Eileen Mairena Cunningham, who is a Mosquito from Nicaragua. And Eileen is also the Southern CSO Active CSO Observer to the Green Climate Fund. And we have Ian Fry, the UN Special Rapporteur for Climate Change. This is a new mandate of the UN systems, which was established in 2021. And I think you started your mandate on the 1st of May this year. So it's really nice to have you here. Of course, many of us know you because you have been very much involved in the UNFCCC negotiations and also in the Indigenous Peoples Caucus and the establishment of the the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform. So a very warm welcome to all of you. And I will go through 2 rounds of questions here with our panelists, and then I really hope that I can also open up for your contributions, your questions, and for some discussions here. So, Áslat, a year ago, in 2021, the Norwegian Supreme Court rendered a landmark decision in favor of the Sami reindeer herders in a case against wind energy developer Fosen Wind. Can you tell us a bit more about that case?
Yes, I do believe that's why I'm sitting here. Joo, puerre päivi pohkaide. Mulla on skuvlalema Asla 4 Asla ja puhutaan Njurkanis tienu lieis. So, good day everybody, my name is Áslat Holmberg. I come from the village of Njurkan, which is in the Tetnu River Valley, and I'm the president of the Saami Council. Could we please get my slide to the screen? Yes, today is the day number 394 of Norway disregarding the ruling of its own Supreme Court, which concluded that this wind power construction on this picture is illegal because it breaks Sami rights. Still to this day they haven't done anything to follow up on this Supreme Court ruling. Fosen is in South Sami area, and it's the biggest continental wind power park in Europe. It's in the territory of Orjelnjark Siite Sami reindeer herding community. Consists of 151 wind turbines and more than 130 kilometers of connecting roads, which have basically destroyed about half of the reindeer's winter grazing lands, as well as some crucial migration routes. And this make it very difficult to continue practicing sustainable reindeer herding in this area. So reindeer avoid wind turbines. This is especially so during the calving season. At that time, reindeer can avoid them up to the distance of 10 kilometers. So you can imagine how huge area is lost from reindeer herding if not only those areas where the wind turbines are standing, but the areas 10 kilometers from them are also avoided by reindeer, and this increases pressure to the other areas. These wind turbines were built without consent from the Saami community, and from the very start the Saami community did raise these concerns and stated that these plans violate their rights. This will force the Saami to reduce the size of their herds, and this means that not all of the 3 families who are utilizing these areas for reindeer herding will be able to continue practicing their traditions or making a living through this livelihood. So in other words, one of the families would have to give up reindeer herding, which is a violation to their collective and individual rights as indigenous Saami. And this would also have an impact on the other 2 families who are using these areas, because in reindeer herding there are a lot of common activities that you have to do in groups. So this collective work burden would then be left to these 2 other families, and of course increase the workload that they have. So all these concerns were raised by the Saami community, but the industry dismissed these concerns and said that they are obeying the Norwegian laws and procedures. After appeals, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination in 2018 requested Norway to put a stop to constructing these wind turbines until the claims of human rights violations have been clarified. In December 2018, Norway officially announced that it ignores the request from the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and they decided to continue construction of the wind turbines. Then if we fast forward to 2021, the Supreme Court of Norway concluded that these wind turbines indeed do violate Saami rights, and a key argument was that they are denied the right to practice their culture, which is the Article 27 in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Yes, this is just one example of many such taking place or planned in Saami territories. And this is just one field of green development or green colonialism that I'm bringing for you. More could be named in fields of hydropower, mining, infrastructure, places like Rästekäisä, Rehpovuotna, Joulavuotna, Kallok, Öifjellet, Tjorgas, the list goes on. And every land grab these days is painted with green paint. And the argument is that we must colonize your lands to save the planet. But if emissions keep growing all the time, then it must be recognized that colonizing our lands and building green energy in our territories is not a solution. It will not solve the climate crisis if you don't reduce emissions. So it's a false solution. And of course we must shift away from fossil fuels, but stealing our lands is not the solution, and we definitely need stronger safeguards for indigenous peoples' rights and rights to traditional territories as it relates to development of green energy as well as funding of green energy projects. So I think I will stop there. So kiitos, thank you.
Thank you very much, Áslat, for this very illustrative case. And in order not to lose any time, I would like to move to our next speaker, Rodion Sulyandziga, and we are now shifting to electric vehicles, which are really seen as an important step towards a greener future. However, the process of extracting nickel, a crucial component for electric vehicle batteries, is very often connected to not so environmentally friendly. And the largest producer of nickel is Nornickel, and it has operated in Russia on indigenous peoples' lands for decades. So, Rodion, can you tell us a bit about how that has impacted indigenous peoples, but also how indigenous peoples have reacted to that, and what are the actions that indigenous peoples have taken?
Okay, thanks, Catherine, and for warm introduction. My name is Rodion Sulyandziga, and I'm from the Eastern Siberia of Russian Federation, and I have been actively engaged into indigenous advocacy for the last 20 years at different levels, including community and United Nations level. And first, I would like to thank IWGIA for organizing this very relevant event, and also our new mandate holder on climate change, because it's also very timely at the level of UN, have a special rapporteur, particularly also to relate indigenous people issue, who are at the front line of the climate change impact. And before going to Russian case, I would like to highlight that after Paris Agreement 2015, all of us, we are changing, because for the first time at the global level, we are having a legally binding global document, an agreement signed by majority of the member states, which provide completely a new paradigm, a new framework, how we can work together, particularly based on the text which recognize and respect the indigenous people rights and their traditional knowledge. But it also provides some kind of new challenges, because we have created completely new languages. And I think in order to move forward together, all of us, we should have the same and common understanding. What is clean energy? What is green economy? What is nature-based solution? Otherwise, all of us, we will fail if we cannot have the same understanding and common approach. And for us, for many of us, it's still a learning process. But we do hope that through such kind of side event and meetings, we get closer to our common approach and understanding what we are talking about. And of course, looking at the Nornickel case in Russia, first of all, we should also understand what is Russian Arctic. And of course, from different angles, different stakeholders can respond to you. For instance, for environments, it's an icon of the Arctic. It's a polar bear and some others, flora and fauna. But for government, it's also a great success how to develop completely fast territories and how to produce lot of industrialization. But also from prospect of indigenous peoples, we can say that Arctic is not a dead zone. It's occupied by many centuries. And for us, Arctic is a living territory. And how to make compromise, how to make a joint solution to move forward. Why? Because Russian Arctic is still very attractive for Russian government, particularly because of minerals, extractive industry, oil, gas, diamond, and Russia is still obsessed by and with Arctic, looking at the Arctic as a new development way to increase Russian economy, particularly also because of climate change, to promote, for instance, Northern Sea route. And we have to keep in mind all kinds of challenges and completely new framework we are facing with. And as indigenous peoples, we don't want to be behind. That's why we are also here at COP, trying to work together. And if you look at the Norilsk case, it's a very Arctic zone. It's one of the most polluted area, not only in the Russian, but in the world. According to New York Times in 2017, the city of Norilsk was called one of the coldest and most polluted industrial city. Maybe now it's not getting colder, but it's certainly now much more polluted than before. In May 2020, near the city of Norilsk, 21 tons of diesel were spilled from a detective tank into tundra, into rivers, into lakes. And this accident is one of the worst environmental disasters that affected Arctic in this century. And many environmentalists and scientists have compared to the 1989 Exxon Valdez disaster in Alaska. And after that, the Aboriginal Forum, its independent Russian networking, appealed to someone who more likely to grab international headlines. And who was it? It was Elon Musk. Because Tesla, one of the biggest buyer of the Nornickel, particularly to produce electric car through battery. But we as indigenous peoples, we don't want the next industrial revolution of electric cars and clean energy developed for the price of indigenous peoples' rights and their traditional land. And of course, the goal of the letter was to use a public name like Elon Musk as an instrument to attract more attention to the Arctic issue, to the Arctic pollution, and to the right of indigenous peoples. And that time we had a great support of more than 70 international organizations, NGOs, and partners join us to sign our appeal to Elon Musk and to Tesla. Here you can see the size of pollution, and it was again one of the massive pollution in the Russian Arctic history this century. So what kind of lesson learned from the Nornickel campaign? Nornickel still is the world's largest producer of nickel and palladium, the minerals necessary for renewable energy, such as nickel, lithium, cobalt, and copper, are critical to the development of green, low-carbon economy. As demand for these transition minerals is skyrocketing, increased mining threatens indigenous rights and territories where there is no comprehensive assessment of risk and harm to indigenous peoples, and complete participation of indigenous peoples who are impacted. And finally, we must send to indigenous people rights and human rights as we transition to the new green economy. And we must ensure that all harms to communities and environment driven by the fossil fuel economy are not replicated in the critical mineral development necessary to transition to low carbon, clean energy projects. And finally, sadly and ironically, till today, indigenous communities in Russia, but not only in Russia, like no other peoples, depend for their security and prosperity on good intentions of those who rule them still. And indigenous empowerment is not a matter of course, but political achievement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rodion. Eileen, now we have heard two very concrete cases on what is happening in two regions. Can you tell us, as the active observer to the GSC, what are the projects that are being supported by the Green Climate Fund? And there has been an increase of financing to renewable energy projects, and how are safeguards being part of the discussions there, and how are indigenous people's rights being addressed there?
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you to all of you to be here today. Yes, the Green Climate Fund have this new guideline on, one of these guidelines of their investments is about energy access. And what you see right now is that the Green Climate Fund has already approved 60 projects that are related with energy access. What happened with these projects is really, I have to say, it's a little bit funny, but not funny, real funny, no? Because what you see, what are these accredited entities that are receiving all these funds are really big banks. It's like, for example, I can say the Bank of Tokyo and the Mitsubishi, or FMO, that also in Latin America have this bad reputation. And then we see that the GCF is constantly focused on this big accredited entity. And it's not the majority of the project, but maybe a quarter of this project are the large project. That means these are projects that go beyond 250 million US dollar. So we have, by example, two of these big projects. One is presented by the World Bank, that is 1.9 billion, and the other is presented by the Mitsubishi Bank, that is also 1.2 billion US dollar. But then when you see all this data, you think, where are the indigenous people included in all this? We have in the Green Climate Fund an indigenous people advocacy team, and now we have an indigenous people advisory team in the Secretariat. The advocacy team normally review all the funding proposals that came, and these proposals are very technical. We have not still identified proposals where indigenous people are present, because that data is not presented. The Green Climate Fund have an indigenous people policy, that the idea of this policy is go beyond of this not harm, and it means that should be intentionally do good. That means also that this accredited entity should review really where they're going to place all these energy projects. Because in most of the process, what you see, as you see with Áslat, with Rodion, all these projects, they just go to indigenous people lands and territories without meaningful consultation, without no communication. Everything is very centralized. So I think there is a great opportunity in the Green Climate Fund for follow up what is going on with the energy process. And also, because right now, if you see all these funding proposals, you see that the Green Climate Fund and also the accredited entity are blind for these indigenous people issues. You read energy access funding proposal, there is no mention of indigenous people if you say these lands is related with indigenous people traditional action, they say, no, but we're not going to have any action in indigenous people land. So they try to do a path that doesn't include indigenous people in the process. And I think that is one of the big challenges, because if you know, the Green Climate Funds is a country-driven, that is the core aspect, if that is country-driven. That means most of, or all of the decision around when and where these funding proposals are going to be implemented is a decision also from the country. The country will give you this letter of support. So I think that's really a big challenge. Right now, if I see the Green Climate Fund for Energy Access and we try to link with indigenous people rights, it's a lot of challenge. Even there is an indigenous people policy, even if there is a advocacy team, even if there is a advisory team in the Green Climate Fund. So I think there is the good thing about challenge, I think, that there is opportunity for us as indigenous people to follow this issue. And I think maybe I'm going ahead, but I think it will be going so good for all of us and also for Ian to look, to review all these funding proposals, to review the energy guideline that the Green Climate Fund have, and see exactly which of these are going to have impact in indigenous people territories. And then we work for that, because if these funding proposals are going to have impact in our lands and territories, that means they have to comply with the indigenous people policy. And the indigenous people policy is really a very robust and high standard policy at global level. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Eileen, and maybe also considering that, just very quickly, that the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group is 3 people and 3 alternates, and if we hear that just energy access projects are 60 and they are several hundred pages long, I mean, we can imagine a little bit also the big tasks there is for very few people who should follow this issue, no, in the Green Climate Fund. Thank you very much, Eileen. Now to Ian. Ian, now we have heard cases and from the GCF, and we would very much like to hear about your new mandate and what you think as UN Special Rapporteur are some of the challenges that you see, and maybe also how they can be addressed, or some of the ways to address them. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. I guess we are seeing 2 major trends globally in the energy area. First is there is an acceleration to get as much of the fossil fuels out of the ground as possible and as quickly as possible to beat the sort of renewable energy market. And then we're seeing these new technologies. Maybe there's 3, I guess. So there's the energy technologies. We've seen the wind turbines, we see the mining of lithium, expansion of dams, this new technology of bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, you know, where large forest areas are being burnt. And then we've also heard the term nature-based solutions as part of this. The third wave of this is that there's a view that we're not doing enough to address the global temperature, so we need radical geoengineering measures to address this. If we overshoot 1.5, we need new radical measures, and this includes solar radiation manipulation. So this is injecting chemicals into clouds to make them more reflective, and therefore theoretically reducing the global temperature of the Earth. And so, again, you're getting this sort of these new technology fixes being applied. So as part of my work as Special Rapporteur, I'm looking at a number of thematic issues. I have to report every 6 months, once to the UN General Assembly and once to the Human Rights Council. And I've picked 6 key themes, and each of those themes has relevance for this discussion. So the first one I've been looking at is the issues in the run-up to this COP. So I've been looking at the issue of loss and damage, and also the issue of protection of human rights defenders and Indigenous peoples' rights defenders. Because we know, as you well know, this expansion of extraction of fossil fuels, expansion of new chemicals to meet these demands for electric vehicles is driving, as we've heard, impacts on Indigenous peoples' lands. And there are now companies, these big companies are now employing security companies to protect their assets. And Indigenous peoples are suffering as a consequence of that. So that's the issue I'm looking at this meeting. The next one is the issue of climate change displacement. So I'm looking at how climate change is displacing people from their lands, and what sort of protection is given to those people, particularly people who are forced across international borders. They're not defined as refugees under the Refugee Convention, and therefore aren't given the same level of protection. The next issue is around litigation and laws around human rights, climate change impacts. And I'm certainly doing a major review of current litigation and seeing where there are gaps. And clearly, as we heard in the case, in the Nordic case, the High Court is not following up on its obligations, and these are some of the issues I want to look at. The fourth issue is corporate accountability. So this is primarily around the issue of disclosure. Where are companies investing their finances? Is it in continuation of fossil fuels? Is it impacting the rights of Indigenous peoples? So I'm looking at this from a human rights perspective. The fifth issue is just transition. So this is looking at people who are working in these fossil fuel sectors, how they are going to be transition out of those and ensure that their rights are protected as well. And this again sort of overlaps critically with Indigenous territories about how people who have colonised those areas, for mining of fossil fuels, how we can find a future for them so they don't just stay there and try and fight long political battles to protect their industry. And the final one is around these new technologies, around these geoengineering technologies. So they're the sort of issues that I'm looking at, and with each one of those issues there's obviously a connection with Indigenous people's rights and the critical issue around free, prior, informed consent. So as my work, I'm preparing these reports. I do country visits to countries to look at these issues. I can write complaint letters to companies, and I've just done one to a major company in Australia, writing to the government and to the company, Woodside Petroleum, for an expansion of a gas exploration plant and processing plant where they're expanding and developing a fertilizer plant on Indigenous land, on land that has ancient rock art, which is being affected by the development of this technology. So I'm waiting to hear back from that company and from the government as to their response. There are other issues that can be worked on from a legal perspective. There's a recent case brought before the Human Rights Committee by the Torres Strait Islanders people, whose lands are disappearing as a consequence of sea level rise. And it's a complaint against the Australian government not doing enough to protect the lands of those peoples. And the Human Rights Committee brought down a decision in favour of the Torres Strait Islander people and said the government has not done enough and they need to do more. So these are some of the options that I've got available to myself. If there are legal cases, I can join by producing what's called an amicus brief, a sort of an advisory opinion from the perspective of me as the Special Rapporteur to lend support to those cases. So these are some of the opportunities that I can provide as Special Rapporteur to assist in these situations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Special Rapporteur, for this, and also very instructive for all of us to know what you're going to work on and how you address cases, etc. And I'm sure that there are a lot of questions already to all of you in the room, but I would like to just first give the panelists the opportunity to reflect a little bit on what should be done differently or what can be done by the UNFCCC, by the system, and also by maybe by the financial sector to address this very clear challenge that we have heard about today. Maybe I want to start with Áslat again.
Yes, thank you, Catherine, and thank you, colleagues, for excellent presentations. As you can hear from the panel, one clear need that arises is need to direct funding in renewables in ways that has safeguards on indigenous people's rights, especially on territorial rights. And as Ian reflected on the need to have robust corporate social responsibility protocols that have high human rights standards, I think recognition of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a guiding document to guide funding on indigenous peoples' territories would be one step. And as our traditional livelihoods are already suffering the impacts of climate change, then we cannot afford to also carry the burden of producing energy to the needs of, to the ever-growing needs, I might say, of the majority society. And consent is the only way to our territories. I think that is a key principle to hold in mind. And as this Fusen case demonstrates, it's not enough to uphold the standards of the colonial governments and their processes, but we must have more strict safeguards on indigenous people's rights, because the colonial governments and their legislations are based on the very presumption that they have the right to take our lands and decide what happens to them and to us, while this is the exact thinking that has led us into this situation where we are in the climate and ecological crisis, and we really have to shift, take a strong turn there and recognize that protection of our rights is also a climate action, and a sustainable development has to be also socially sustainable. So yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Yes, Rodion. Yeah, the question was what you think that the UNFCCC and also finance institutions can do in order to address these challenges that we have heard about today.
Yes, thank you, Catherine. Well, first, I strongly believe that indigenous peoples and their contribution to climate conversation does not need any longer introduction. Even today, we can say that indigenous peoples have their hard-won visibility in any international forum, including COP27. And also, I strongly believe that the biggest contribution the indigenous peoples have made is sharing their resources and lands. But its exploitation has already exceeded all possible and acceptable limits. I think that is the clash between indigenous peoples, governments, and business. And today is a finance day under the COP. And of course, financial resources is also a key instrument on the way to solution. But once again, I see two major constraints or challenges we are facing with. The first one, any new developments are blocked or even practically impossible to implement due to the system that was put into place a long time ago, and it is still based on colonial or paternalistic policies of the past. And we should first overcome this at the domestic level. And the second point is often when the progress is made, and we see this, a lot of projects achieved, it becomes evident it lacks follow-up mechanism. And I think that is the stage we are facing with, how to find a proper mechanism to implement all kinds of commitment, including financial one. Because it is also a dilemma even for indigenous peoples. It's not just a dilemma for business and governments, but also a big, markable question for indigenous peoples themselves. But I believe we have already to start this open dialogue to build more trust and to build more options to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I was hearing all the panelists, and one of the things that I forget to mention is that now when they talk about transition to energy clean, they have cut out the justice approach that we really are pushing to have in all this process. If you see all the documentation of the Green Climate Fund, they are not talking again about justice. So the just transition to energy is out. It's just transition. That means that they're going with everything against indigenous people, territories, lands, even from local communities, other communities that are at local level. So I think that's one big issue that maybe we have to push in this COP27. We have to keep pushing for the human rights approach in climate change decisions, because if not, they're not looking to the communities, they're not looking to the lands and territories of indigenous people, and they just want to solve a problem, creating bigger problems at global level. Áslat talked about direct access to funds. When we see all the data about all the funding that are around in the world, there are studies that already show that less than 1% of these funds are going to indigenous people. So how are we going to be really involved in the process if all these mechanisms, all these corporation business are not looking the indigenous people as partner of this process? If they want to invest their project that are going to be in our territories, we should be the partners, and also should be under our terms, with the free prior informed consent, with the full and effective participation, and the human rights approach should be in the front line of this. Other thing that I think that is important here, tackling in all the climate finance issue, is about the climate finance right now is looking only the developing country, and I'm fully support this, but then we have indigenous people from developed countries that are facing a lot of challenge with the climate change impact. And indigenous people from your country, they are not included in all this discussion of climate finance because, no, it's not covered. So I think there should be a space there to include those indigenous people that are being affected in developed countries also. And yes, I think the issue of invest in locally led process, that this process should be led by indigenous people at the local level, is one of the issues very important when we are talking about energy and also to local level. Thank you.
Thank you, Eileen. And Ian, of course, you have already told us a bit how you're reporting to the UN Human Rights Council and the General Assembly, but it would also be interesting to hear from you how you engage with the UNFCCC. Sometimes we see a bit of disconnect of these UN bodies, the ones dealing with human rights and those dealing with climate change. So, I mean, your mandate is really excellent for maybe bridging that gap. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that the bridging the gap is the critical issue. I guess in answer to your original question, there are two key words that we can come up with. One is accountability, and the other is representation. For many years, I was a negotiator for the government of Tuvalu and was in the rooms negotiating words and commas, and I never got to go to side events like this. There seems to be two parallel universes operating at COPs, the negotiations and the side events. And there doesn't seem to be a wormhole between those two parallel universes. And the system that's wrong. The system is wrong. So I've now moved over to the parallel universe, attending side events. And I can see all these great ideas, and I think, why didn't I know about these when I was negotiating commas and words and things like that? And that comes into the issue of representation. And in my report to the UN General Assembly this year, I recommended that the COP pass a decision to allow civil society, indigenous peoples organisations to be effective participants in decision-making processes of the COP. It's not that difficult. There are other international treaties where that takes place. Civil society and indigenous peoples can propose decisions for COPs to take. This COP seems to be, very slow in the process. Having been in this process, I've seen an evolution of representation. Of course, we fought very hard to actually get the words Indigenous peoples in the decisions under the CDM. And that came back when we were negotiating the Paris Agreement, whether we should have the letter S after peoples, and we managed to show that there was precedent there. But I attended the meeting of the local communities and Indigenous Peoples platform in Bonn. It was the first time I'd actually attended it. And I was quite disappointed in how that was run, I guess. In that it should be a platform for bringing forward the issues that Indigenous peoples want addressed at the COP. And it was more a discussion platform for what other institutions are doing. And I suspect there's an issue there, dare I say, within the Secretariat about how that Indigenous community platform is managed. And we're seeing slowly, you know, some inroads into the process. So we have an observer at the Green Climate Fund. Hopefully we'll have a decision maker at the Green Climate Fund at some stage. And so these are the issues where it's not just tokenism, it's full decision making is the critical aspect. So that was one of the recommendations. And just quickly to jump into one of the other recommendations I made at the General Assembly, and this is around climate change activists, particularly Indigenous peoples activists. We know that a number of Indigenous peoples have been killed for being activists around their causes. So I made a recommendation that the International Law Commission develop legal procedures to give protection to human rights and Indigenous peoples defenders, and to establish an international tribunal for the prosecution of people who perpetrate violence against environmental and Indigenous rights defenders. We can't just rely on national governments to do that. And I also suggest that the International Criminal Court should include within their definition of ecocide a definition of crimes against environmental and Indigenous rights defenders. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Also, thank you very much for your frank remarks and constructive inputs to some of the processes here. I'm sure our panelists have some additional points, but I would really like to open up for some questions and comments and contributions from the room here. So anyone, I can see a hand there and one there. 1, 2, 3.
Hello, my name is Chris Stone. I'm a senior at Swarthmore College studying engineering and environmental studies. I wanted to build on your point on recognizing climate refugees. I am Burmese Chinese. My parents immigrated from Myanmar. Myanmar is not present at this conference. It was not present at the conference last year. We have gone under decades of being under colonization and a military regime. And I wanted to recognize, when we talk about safeguarding the rights of Indigenous peoples in business-driven climate action, because in my research of how migrants from Myanmar are placed into different refugee programs, many of these migrants are not necessarily considered legal refugees. Only a fraction of the ethnic minorities are considered refugees, while there is a vast majority of migrants that are all climate refugees in some form. Myanmar has been undergoing severe flooding for decades now, beyond anything they have experienced before, while also being one of the greatest biodiversity hotspots in the world, and they are not present here at this conference. I want to bring up 3 points that I found in my research of farming incubator programs to provide an opportunity to these refugees to, rather than be shuffled into factory jobs where they make extremely low wages, but instead call upon their ecological knowledge from their experiences of subsistence farming from their homes. While it is great that this is an opportunity through farming incubators for refugees and migrants from Myanmar to contribute to local foodways, again, much of the funding for these farms only goes towards legally recognized refugees, as opposed to many groups who are all climate refugees looking to support themselves independently. The second is the structure around many of these farming incubator programs. They dominate with white folks from those neighborhoods who make decisions for them about how these people should be farming. What sort of ecological knowledge are they allowed to bring in? On many cases, I saw where refugees were being taught, oh, in order to sell your foods, you cannot sell this type of food. You cannot sell one that looks like this or that is from your culture in that way. Those will not sell. be able to sell to a Whole Foods market, it continues to perpetuate the erasure of the cultural heritage that is already being oppressed while they're experiencing political strife back home. And finally, the issue of language justice, where constantly these people are being asked to sign contracts that are not in their native languages, and they are then sold into debt over and over again to continuously never truly give them a chance for autonomy in supporting themselves through the ecological knowledge that they were told they would be able to flourish within. So that is all I really wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all the panelists. My name is John. I'm the head of the Indigenous Peoples Unit. I have to run to the FAO Pavilion. We are going to have a side event on Indigenous Peoples food systems, and we are going to touch upon energy. So of course, you are all invited. But I just wanted to make two comments and an invitation. The first comment is on the difficulties of the Green Climate Fund. And I think many of the implementing partners, we find difficulties in ensuring that the funding arrives to indigenous peoples at the local level. We run a small unit at the global level. We have tried the Green Climate Fund facility, but also it's difficult. And we get a lot of obstacles from the host countries. First, because in many countries it's not a priority, but not only, because there seems to be competition with use of the funds for other means that are not necessarily related with climate action and not necessarily related to indigenous peoples. So we are extremely interested in collaborating from our side to see how at the global level we can do something about it. Some of the proposals we have tried to put, they had a high political and advocacy content. So it was more important to get a GCF proposal fully dedicated to indigenous peoples at the global level than much more than some of the activities. It was like a flag to lead a path that opens a door that we find closed these days. The other point is we have a coalition on indigenous peoples' food systems. And one of the major issues we see with indigenous peoples, with food systems, with global food systems, is that they don't do any energy balance. They don't look at the use of energy. So this is why many of the food systems are unsustainable. They don't input the energy use. And basically we are all subsidizing cheap food with high energy cost and environmental cost. So we are creating a small energy group in the coalition of indigenous peoples' food systems. And we would like to invite you, as well as some of the other colleagues in the room, to join us on this, because the debate that connects energy with food is almost non-existent. And it's an entry point that we can work together, and of course we invite the UN Special Rapporteur to join us in Rome and launch a discussion with indigenous peoples to connect food with energy use. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the good presentation from our speakers of the day. My name is Anne Samante from Pido, Kenya. I come from the Maasai indigenous community in Kenya. Now, mine is just a comment, or basically I want to just give some small contribution as per our experience in Kenya. In Kenya, there's a lot of investment in the renewable energy. Just in this COP where we are today, the Kenyan government is entering into a deal to receive $30 billion that has been promised or committed this COP. What does that translate into? That translates into more families are going to be evicted, more indigenous communities are going to be evicted. And we already have existing cases that you have not even gotten a solution to. Most of these cases are pending in courts, and the court processes are very expensive. I mean, it is a situation that is almost going out of hand. It is a very, very unfortunate situation. So when we hear of such a commitment, this time it sends chills through our spine. It's just very worrying. And so this is an area that we need a lot of support. Remember, this is a community that is already very fragile. The droughts right now are causing havoc. Then again, you come and impose some other more trouble. I think we need so much support. We need to just get our way out because it's getting out of hand. And so that was just my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Tungarai, a Rai indigenous nation from Nepal. I work with Nepal Federation of Indigenous Nationalities, NEFIN, one of the co-organizers of this site event. I just would like to share also our very common experience from Nepal around the so-called clean energy. Nepal NDC explains that the existing production of hydropower in Nepal is around only 1,500 megawatt, but it targets to produce 50,000 megawatt by 2050. That's huge production of hydropower projects. And we have already experienced a lot of issues around indigenous people's land and rights violation by the mega dams and hydropower projects. So you can imagine how massive is the impact of hydropower and the so-called energy transition in every country, like Áslat talked about in Nordic and others. No? This is just to share the common experience. The form is different, but in essence, it's about the land, it's about the displacement and right violation. And second is, I have a question to Special Rapporteur. You talked about the corporate responsibility and disclosure of information and so on. By the way, I'm also one of the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group member in the Green Climate Fund from ASA. And I'm saying this because the Green Climate Fund information disclosure is really, really worrisome at some point. When the funding proposals come from the private sector, they don't disclose information publicly. They don't disclose. So how can we get the sense how that's going to affect us and our land, either positively or negatively? So how would you see, or how can you help with this kind of, challenges that's with the information disclosure and access to information around climate action and climate finance? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the comments and for the sharing from Myanmar and Kenya, Nepal, and I can see one more hand. Maybe we can take that and then we can take a round here with the panel. Yes.
Ya, terima kasih. Terima kasih. Perkenalkan, nama saya Dolphina Kum dari Papua. Pertanyaan saya adalah tambang freeport menghancurkan alam, sungai, gunung, semua yang ada di kampung saya, di suku Amungme dan Kamoro. Bagaimana Bapak bicara energi pembaharuan energi bisa menyelamatkan yang rusak tadi, yang rusak, yang hilang. Terus pertama itu, yang kedua, bagaimana dana dari dana yang tadi untuk masyarakat adat, komunitas perempuan itu bisa mengelola dana yang tadi dibicarakan, ada bantuan, karena saya tidak yakin dana ini akan sampai di pemerintah Indonesia dan akan banyak, tetapi tidak akan sampai di kami di Papua. Terima kasih, dua itu saja.
Okay, I will translate. I'm Sarah, I'm from Indonesia with her and my friend. My name is Adolfina Kum, I'm from the Papua. I'm from the Indigenous people of the Amukme Kamoro, and first, I'm living in the area of the PT Freeport, the mining affiliation with the US and also Indonesia right now. And since 50 years ago, Freeport just working with the extractive industry in my village, also destroy our river, our sea, and our lands. And one thing that I want to know, can the mining of the industry extractive just move to the renewable energy? That first one. And another one is the how the fund, like a green climate fund, can make empower the women, also especially for the indigenous women in my country, especially is West Papua, for the get the fund to empowering just for the women indigenous people. And I also for my question, I also have a question about the Indonesia right now. They have a enhanced NDC for the like energy first. They have like a biofuel and then biomass is the one the issue that really higher from the side to the renewable energy. And the another hand is a green climate fund just coming in Indonesia. The fund is not yet to distribute to the people in the village. Like Dolly say, can the indigenous women first get the fund for empowering the women in the village, something like that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think the questions were mainly to you, Ian and Eileen. So maybe I will start with Ian, with you, to maybe also respond to some of the comments and to the two questions.
Yeah, yes. Well, first around the issue of the court cases in Kenya and the issue of access to courts because they're so expensive. This is one of the issues I want to look at, is access to courts for people to be properly represented. So I'm very pleased you brought that up, and I will certainly look into that issue of access to courts and how that can be improved. The issue of hydro dams is an enormous one, and it's around the world. I mean, there are technologies to be able to produce hydroelectric powers without having to produce large dams and taking large land. So it's possible, but it's and of course the added issue, particularly for Nepal and Bhutan, is the melting of the glaciers and what the potential huge impact that might have on these dams and the potential massive loss of lives if those dams don't hold. As far as the GCF and disclosure issues, I'll hand over to our GCF expert on that one.
Thank you, Ian. And thank you, Alfonsine, for your question. Adolfina, sorry. Yeah, we have to be clear that the Green Climate Fund have this country-driven approach. That means every action that have to be approved by the country. And in some cases, we have very bad cases where our countries don't recognize that are indigenous people, and that also is so difficult to have access to our governments. The GCF in each country have this NDA, that is the national designated authority. Yes, thank you. Yeah. So you should know who is your NDA, and that is the first a way to start to do advocacy, to do lobby with your NDA. One of the big challenges that we have is in most of the country, the NDA is the Minister of Finance, and they are completely blind about cultural issues. But in some countries, like mine, even as the Minister of Finance, we have good experience to approach the NDA and to have a process of capacity building that they had been working with the indigenous people here. About the empowerment of women and indigenous people in the GCF funding proposal, there is something in the GCF that is the readiness program, and each country have every year $1 million to have access to preparation for different activities. And there is a possibility, if you lobby with your country, there is a possibility that they allocate part of this money to capacity building, to empower of women and indigenous people in your country. My country did that in 2019, and it's not only for Nicaragua, they did it also for Latin America. So there are examples that we can push like that. Other thing is about, in the last COP in Glasgow, there was a COP26 guidance for the GCF. And in this guidance, they say that, I'm just trying to use the word, they should include, and they have to look, the GCF have to look for mechanisms to include more CSO, indigenous people, private sector, to have access to the fund. And in the past meeting in Antigua and Barbuda, the board member of GCF approved this, they accept this decision, and it's supposed that the secretary and the board member are going to look for this mechanism to include more indigenous people and other stakeholders in the process. There is also something that we can use in our lands and territories where, when one funding proposal came, that is the IRM, that is the Independent Redress Mechanism. You can, if there is a funding proposal that came to your land and territory that was not consulted, that is doing harm to your territory, you can place a complaint in the IRM, and they will start a process of investigation around this. So there are some tools that we can use. Thank you.
It seems we are coming to the conclusion, and just very briefly, my final remarks with regards to the topic discussed today. I think most of us sitting in this room, we still believe strongly that we need new technology. We need transition to green economy, because even for indigenous peoples, it will provide more advantages. But also we must have the rights, basic rights, not just a concession or privilege, but basic rights including our self-determination right, land rights, and rights for our own development. And that is the best scenario. The worst scenario from my prospect is to switch or to move from resource curse or colonization to green colonization. So, and we should avoid this type of development. And I think all of us, we are here just to keep the right track. Thank you.
Yes, so thank you all for good comments and questions, and I think we see unfortunate common thread in the comments that were raised, that people are being evicted, they're losing their livelihoods in the name of green development. We heard examples from Kenya, from Nepal, Russia, Sapmi, and I think all these highlight the need to keep in mind that development has to be also socially sustainable in order for it to be sustainable development. And indeed we need the human rights approach to climate work in general, and especially with the funding institutions. I want to thank Sister Eileen for highlighting that that funding needs to be available for all regions. The Arctic is warming the fastest in the world, and we can already see our ecosystems collapsing, and our livelihoods are going through some transformative changes. We're experiencing really strong shifts in the winters that we have, and those are bound to become stronger and stronger during this century. And if we are losing winters, then what is left of the Arctic if we as a winter people are losing our winters? So there is really an urgent need for us to adapt, and that needs capacity, it needs resources, and it also needs to we need to be part of decision making. How do we adapt? So I want to thank Ian for raising two very important points regarding accountability and representation. Indeed, business also needs to be held accountable, and financiers need to be held accountable that their funds and that their projects are respecting human rights and indigenous peoples' rights. And indeed, we need to be around those tables where decisions are being made that impact us. In the UN system, there is the ongoing work regarding enhanced participation of indigenous peoples, and I think that also needs to reach the UNFCCC process. We have a lot of colleagues working on policy and being part of the negotiations, so I think the work of the Indigenous Peoples Caucus must be recognized, and the work done in the local communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform, and those could really inform the work of the subsidiary bodies and the COPs. And finally, I want to also thank Ian for highlighting a very important point on environmental and indigenous people's rights defenders, and that's a great proposal for having an international tribunal for prosecution of assaults against environmental rights and indigenous people's rights defenders, because that's a very worrying trend that we are experiencing. And how can we think that our human rights and environmental rights are upheld if those people who on the ground are being attacked and taken into custody or killed or assaulted? And that is a very essential part of the climate justice work as well, to ensure that human rights defenders are able to do their work on their local basis without threats. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we have had a really interesting discussion here, I think, today. We have heard about evictions related to climate change actions. We have heard about land grabbing in the name of green transition. We have heard about the pollution of indigenous people's lands in order to get components for batteries, which is really absurd in a way. We have heard about due diligence processes that are not transparent and that are really difficult for indigenous peoples to access. And I just want to give you a very small example, because I think that was just so illustrative. It was a dialogue between a person from a company and an indigenous representative. And the person from the company said that they found it extremely difficult to know how to access indigenous communities, who to talk to and who are the right people to contact. And then the indigenous representative looked at her and said, well, what do you think it is like for us? We have no idea how to access the CEOs, how to get into your machinery. And I really think that's, that's often forgotten, right? Then we have heard about the need to really push for a human rights-based approach to climate action. And we have heard about the need for direct funding for indigenous peoples, but also, or including territorial rights. And I think many of you have said such strong things. We need to see the protection of indigenous peoples' rights as climate action. The biggest contribution by indigenous peoples has been to actually share their territories. We need system change and change the narrative. Indigenous peoples have to be decision makers in the COP, in the UNFCCC, and the local communities and indigenous peoples platforms should bring issues that indigenous peoples want to discuss to the COP. And then the whole link with the human rights system, but also with the whole discussion on participation that is going on in other parts of the UN needs to be brought here to the UNFCCC. And I think I have probably forgotten a lot of things, but these are some of the things that I have noted down in these really rich contributions and discussions. And I would like to thank the panelists very much for your participation here, for your contributions, for this discussion, and everyone who has attended this event. And we've been all extremely good at timekeeping, so we're actually 5 minutes early, which is not so often. But I think that there is a lot of really interesting people in this room, and now we have 5 minutes where we can stay in this room and where we can talk together more informally and share a little bit more. So I would like to invite you all to come and talk to the panelists, or talk to each other. Yeah? Thank you all.